Spoiler warning. This is your spoiler warning for this episode. In the podcast, we talk about a lot of sitcoms, but we really only get into the finer plot points of How I Met Your Mother and BBC's Sherlock. So check the podcast description for those timestamps of the discussions if you don't want to get spoiled. Now, on to the show. So I think we've firmly established so far that my initial theory didn't hold. As a reminder, I thought that shows with good endings gently faded away, while shows with divisive endings kept their fandoms locked into inner fan arguments. But none of my interviewees so far have agreed. And last episode, with the help of Destination Toast, we explored the Fix-It tag on AO3 as a means for looking at how fandoms respond to the end of their TV series. Of course, while playing with numbers was fun, AO3 isn't representative of all fandom or even of all fan writers, and not every Fix-It fic is even tagged as such. Speaking of which, I did want to give two clarifications. First, in the last episode, I said that Banana Fish had the highest percentage of works tagged Fix-It. Although Toast did their best to pull a representative sample, we still can't say Banana Fish is definitively the top show in this metric. There could well be other fandoms with even higher percentages, but that just weren't captured in that particular review. Second, I misspoke and implied that tag Wranglers on AO3 add tags to works. That's not accurate. Wranglers organize tags and sometimes create metatags that can be used to search or filter for subtags, but it is only the authors who can add tags to their own works. Tag Wranglers are not doing that. So, egg on my face for misleading my audience on those elements. I'm sorry. But moving on from focusing on AO3, there does seem to be something special about certain shows and their endings that keep their fandom actively engaged, well after a series has come to its conclusion. I've been brainstorming this topic with friends, and by brainstorming, I mostly mean me ranting to them about why fandoms, i.e. Supernatural, are so dang resilient. Regardless, during our conversations, I realized most of my examples of TV endings were from a specific era of television. I guess you could say I came of age during a time when television was transitioning away from episodic TV that basically resets the playing field at the end of each episode, to more overarching plot arcs across one or even multiple seasons. TV in the era of Star Trek, the original series, didn't expect viewers to sit down every week to catch that week's episode. So each episode could effectively stand alone. The storyline essentially reset by the end of each 30 minutes or hour of television. But as more families adopted TV sets into their living rooms and built their schedules around it, shows had more freedom to develop longer, overarching plot lines across episodes and occasionally even seasons. You can see this transition in the way that Star Trek: The Next Generation was made up of standalone adventures, while Deep Space Nine, especially in the later seasons, had these big themes that reverberated across the seasons, like the Dominion War. Okay, so Trekkie ranting aside, this is all to say that I've been thinking more about the ways that the shows are structured. Does it matter if the show is more episodic versus narrative for how that ending is perceived by the fandom? For a show that has a longer narrative arc, how much do they have to set up in earlier seasons for them to earn the payoff, or the fans' ire, at the end of the series?
The ending to the season is the thing that you're always kind of driving towards. I think that should be the goal anytime I'm kind of writing anything. But then that also, through the process, that ending tends to change whenever whenever it wants to too.
Mike Fisher, better known as Fish, has spent a lot of time thinking about endings and how they can change as you move along in the creative process. Fish is currently working on a narrative fiction podcast and has already seen how early changes can create ripples that can take the story toward a different ending than originally planned, meaning later story beats have to be rewritten. Even when you're putting all the pieces in place for a big reveal, sometimes you realize your plan has to shift if the original story ending no longer fits. This isn't just true of us podcasters. It happens to TV writers all the time.
I think they sometimes get locked in on an idea too and don't want to change it. I think that's what happened with How I Met Your Mother, which I think was pretty famously, a lot of people didn't enjoy that ending.
I hinted at this at the end of last episode, but I feel like the entire premise of How I Met Your Mother was a faulty Chekov's gun. Okay, so let me back up and explain this analogy. The idea comes from Anton Chekov, hence the name, and his advice for young playwrights. He stated, "If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there." Essentially, if you have a setup and no payoff, you're going to piss off your audience who will feel tricked or cheated. In the name alone, you can tell the premise of How I Met Your Mother is a story coming from the dad to his kids about how he met their mom. But the viewer doesn't know which character is the mom. It's an interesting setup for a show. It has that puzzle box mystery element to it, where as you're watching, you're trying to see if you can figure out who the mom is before the narrator makes that big reveal. And because the show is a sitcom, you didn't need to go murder board conspiracy theorist over the whole thing. It could just be a fun game to play with your friends. As entertainment reporter Casey told me,
we could talk about it pretty easily. We could take the inside jokes from the show and then use it in real life, because it was like a group of my friends in college who all watched the show. We all labeled each other as like the characters in the show.
I don't think the show's creators quite expected it to last as long as it did. The series ran for 9 seasons, which is impressive even for sitcoms. And after nearly a decade of drawing out the mystery, fans of the show had high hopes for the conclusion.
You know, I remember like when we were all watching it together, it was a big deal. Like we scheduled time. We had a little living room with a tiny TV and we all watched and we were all kind of angry.
Fellow fan and podcaster/head of content for Geekscape.net, Matt Kelly, had much the same reaction.
It was one that me and my college friends would get together and watch after we were done college. And I remember that finale showing up at my friend's house to watch, and I brought a box of tissues because I was like, I am ready to cry. This is going to be an emotional thing. And then I felt nothing for this hour. And I was like, how could they fumble it so badly?
Indeed. How could they? And here's where spoilers come in.
You kind of spend the entire series falling in love with the main character, with this idea of a person. And in the final season, you do meet that person after years and seasons of watching this main character like date and watching like all of their friends interact with each other and be like, you'll find your person. You meet her, you do fall in love with her. She was played by Kristen Milioti, who I still have a crush on. And then, spoiler alert, she dies. And the main character ends up with one of the friends who, throughout the series, I think they attempted to do a will they, won't they thing, but it was pretty definitively like the entire audience was like, no, this doesn't work for many reasons. But they still put those two characters together in a way that I think was like disingenuous to what they had been building up to, or what we had been expecting based off of what had been happening in the show.
So, Chekov's gun? Yeah, that thing backfired on the creators of How I Met Your Mother in a bad way. Matt compared it to having similar problems to Game of Thrones, namely in the pacing of the final season.
My problem with the How I Met Your Mother finale is similar to what my problem is with the Game of Thrones finale, which is that structurally and story-wise, I get it. Like, it is the correct ending. It's the pace in which the ending is told. So if you watch the final season of How I Met Your Mother, the whole final season is a 2-day weekend wedding that's stretched out across like 16, 17 episodes. And even though it's over 2 days, you absolutely just like fall in love with Ted and the mother. And you get so like connected to their emotional connection. You absolutely love the mother. And there are flash forwards that definitely hint tragedy. And me and my friends were talking about, we're like, I think the mother's dead. I think that's why he's telling this story to his kids. And you start to like piece together that might be what's happening. What happens is that the final episode is like the next 15 years of all of these characters' lives just told in like 40 minutes. And it's so like moving so quickly that like you find out the mother died and you have like 2 seconds to feel sad about it before Ted's running off to be with Robin. And if you had paced it out, that would have worked. But like the way the story is told, it almost makes the mother just feel like a placeholder until Robin showed up. It really kind of ruined everything.
You go on this big, long journey trying to figure out how it'll all come to a head, only for you to end up where you started.
How I Met Your Mother, the ending doesn't stick the landing because it's almost like everything that happened before then didn't matter. Nothing really connects back to each other the way that we wanted it to.
By setting up this concept, but not having the payoff meet expectations, a bunch of fans left the show feeling upset and like it was all a waste of time. I wonder, if this had been a miniseries or a movie with a predefined length, if the creators would have had an easier time crafting the ending. By getting the show renewed again and again for new seasons, creators had to keep pushing off the reveal. And apparently, this even led to some character inconsistencies.
You hear the stories behind the scenes. They shot a chunk of the finale during season 2. And that's another problem I have, is a lot of the characters have to get retconned to be back to who they were in the second season for the ending that they wrote to fit. So you lose like 6 seasons of character development in like one swoop. It's the number one reason why I have not gone back to rewatch that show.
So in the case of How I Met Your Mother, I feel pretty confident in saying the long narrative arc was more a problem than a panacea. It was fun to have a silly sitcom with an underlying mystery, right up until the mystery was solved with bad pacing and a final plot twist that didn't evolve with the show across the 9 seasons. But at least How I Met Your Mother tried to solve the puzzles it set out at the beginning of the show. Its real problem was the curse of its own success and drawing the show out for far too long. So what about shorter shows with even more rabid fandoms? What about BBC's Sherlock?
If you love something and love it so much that you've made it a part of your identity, like I am a blank fan and this is within me, and then the new installment comes out and it's awful. It's like, am I awful? Right? And you're like, well, surely that's not, surely, and surely my read on this initially wasn't, like, something's gone wrong, right? Like, we've got to hunt for the real culprit.
Fansplaining's Elizabeth has seen firsthand what happens to a fandom that gets too conspiracy-brained about their show. In this case, it was the final season of Sherlock.
They were like, convinced when the next season of Sherlock came out, which was so bad, that they were like, this is fake, and surely there's a secret 4th episode, right? That was huge for fandom. And I think we see the reverberations now, 10 years on, all over the place, because a lot of those people kind of cut their teeth in TJLC, whatever age they were, but some of them were quite young.
I know TJLC is probably just meaningless jargon for some of you listeners? Don't worry, we'll get there in a moment. Beginning in 2010, the BBC produced a polished, modernized version of the classic Sherlock Holmes stories. Benedict Cumberbatch played the titular character, with Martin Freeman taking the role of Watson. The first season was generally highly rated, with a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. That didn't last. Seasons, or series as they're called in the UK, 1 through 3 maintained a strong approval rating over 90%, but the last season tanked with a 54% on Rotten Tomatoes. According to The Guardian, the 4th season of Sherlock ended with its lowest ever audience numbers, at 5.9 million viewers. This was lower than any episode since the show launched in 2010, though I should mention it was still the most watched program for its time slot. Part of the problem was the mystery box setup that the writers no longer seemed interested in playing off of in any meaningful way. Mystery novels work because readers are given all the pieces to solve the whodunit themselves. The big reveal allows readers to test if they caught the right clues and allows them to piece the story together themselves. Sherlock gradually threw out this entire premise, choosing instead to try to prove how clever they were by not even allowing the audience a chance to solve the mystery for themselves. By the final season, this became just a tangle of seemingly non-sequiturs that only felt clever because the viewer was too lost to try and solve the plot themselves. And I say this as someone who bought the first season on iTunes just so I could watch it over and over again on my iPod video. So the erratic plotting of the final season was one problem. But the real problem for hardcore fans was something less textual.
I think it's really hard for fans to see what the terms might be for television shows, for the creators of those shows. I think for, people who are really attached to a ship and who make that the kind of centerpiece and the only thing that matters.
Remember TJLC? That stands for the JohnLock Conspiracy theory. If you're a Tumblr user, then I'm sure this is like explaining water to a fish. Hasn't it always just been there?
One that I did read many primary sources of was TJLC, which was in the Sherlock fandom about 10 years ago when the 3rd season of Sherlock came out. And that was a very formalized conspiracy theory that involved, kind of foundational texts that people wrote explaining exactly what the conspiracy was, right? And like people kind of had conversion narratives where they said, I read this and now I understand, right? It's like QAnon's whatever. I don't know. Is there like a manifesto,
This fandom theory stated that the ultimate endgame for the show Sherlock was for Watson and Sherlock to end up in a romantic relationship. From the website Fanlore, after the 4th series ended in 2017, some TJLCers argued that there was a 4th, as yet unaired episode of the 4th series that would vindicate their theory, and many are still waiting for it to be released.
There were reasons why Sherlock really tanked in quality by the end, and I don't think that was it. And I could name a few of them. Like, it's bad, and sure, I could see trying to create some sort of structured explanation, but that doesn't really, again, that kind of like sits in that denial place, like that doesn't really get you anywhere, and it's not productive on any front.
So, even if you build a show with fun mysteries, you can kill your audience's goodwill by either A, allowing the writing to decline, becoming more reliant on tropes instead of solving mysteries, or B, not meeting fans' expectations for certain ships to be canonized. The second failing feels less reliant on the creators and more an issue of fans becoming too wrapped up in the so-called fanon. In other words, they started to believe the elements introduced by fans, which are not in the official canon of the fictional world. These elements can even become a cultural norm within that group of fandom. But that doesn't make them canon. Then again, creators benefited from this intense fandom engagement. So were they baiting these fans to keep them watching? That sounds like it needs to be a whole separate podcast, a post-mortem on Sherlock and TJLC. So we started this episode with a discussion around setup and payoff. Do long narrative arcs do better or worse in ending their shows than TV series that are more episodic in nature? Another way we could look at this: how important is the ending of a show? Does it color the whole experience of watching all the previous episodes? Or can we happily rewatch any old episode we come across while channel surfing without getting frustrated by thinking about the ending? I've had several guests argue that there's a genre that is best set up for this kind of success. The ending that doesn't tick off their audience with the highest batting average seems to be sitcoms.
I feel like comedies do it better, or like sitcoms often. Maybe because they don't try and do anything too over the top. They try and give their characters like a happy ever after, and the themes were always less intense. So no character is going to, die in a horrible way.
This is Dr. Georgia Carroll, who earned her PhD from the University of Sydney doing case studies on both Supernatural and the artist Taylor Swift.
My doctorate is in sociology, but I specifically studied within the field of fan studies and celebrity studies. So my work kind of engaged at an intersection of those two fields. So fan studies is kind of more focused on texts, and celebrity studies is obviously more focused on celebrity and kind of the power structures and influence of celebrity. But I was looking at celebrity fandom.
Georgia seemed like an obvious person to interview about the ending of Supernatural, but I'm saving that portion of our conversation for later in the season. That being said, she did point out that endings for shows with strong fandoms already have a huge hurdle to jump.
So I think that's the thing with endings. Fans have these attachments and then they have big emotions, and it kind of then puts a filter over an ending that maybe if you were just somebody casually watching, you'd be like, oh my, that's fine, I guess. But when you have that connection, you're like, how dare they give him a child, or how dare they do that? Why is she back from the dead? Why is he doing this? And suddenly it becomes a big thing when really it's like a 40-minute supernatural themed TV show. Like, it's not that deep, but it is at the same time.
In this case, she was speaking about the fandom around Teen Wolf, but the pattern holds with other shows. If you're already heavily emotionally invested, that ending is going to have to do so much more work.
I think on the one hand, you're never going to appease the whole fandom because the whole fandom has never been appeased about anything in its life.
But back to the topic of sitcoms. Georgia wasn't the only one to point out how they tend to leave their characters in a happy place. Matt Kelly, who you heard at the top of this episode, said much the same thing.
And I think that that's like a weird thing a lot with sitcoms. Sitcoms actually, I believe, have a slightly higher success rate than a lot of other shows. Parks and Rec is another one that I think has a great finale. Despite what a lot of people think of the latter Stephen Carell-less seasons of The Office, I think everyone agrees The Office finale is still like really a good finale. I think doing a sitcom finale is usually pretty easy. If all of your characters are in a good, happy place, then your audience is like going to walk away happy.
Most sitcoms, unlike How I Met Your Mother, tend to have a pretty straightforward formula that resets after each episode. It starts with some friends hanging out, there is an incident, shenanigans ensue, but by the end, the whole world kind of resets. It's like putting your toys back in the toy box after taking them out for a little adventure.
Part of the reason why sitcoms to this day are still the most beloved of television, even though it's not the most critically acclaimed, but a show like Supernatural, a show like Buffy, it's these shows that have stayed in our lives so long that they really feel like they're part of our our friend group. They're part of our lives. They're part of the way that we talk to people. Like, we watch these shows and we say like, oh my God, I'm Danny from Mindy Project, or like, I'm Nick from The New Girl. Like, you see yourself in these characters and you see your friends in these characters. And when you send them off happy, you also feel like you and your friends get to continue the story yourself through your own lives. Like, that's the benefit of a sitcom. The characters are so relatable and so likable and so close to real people that you know, that like, you want to see them all happy. You want to see them all go and like fulfill their dreams. And you, when they walk away, you want to just pick up where they left off and start following your dream.
Sitcoms, on average, seem to have this quality where you can pick them up and put them down without much changing. It's not universally true, as we saw with How I Met Your Mother. And, in fact, some sitcoms do manage those bigger narrative arcs that complete with an incredibly satisfying ending. I'm looking at you, The Good Place. But overall, sitcoms don't tend to make the charts for prolific fanfic writing or walls of fan art on Tumblr. They're fun, they feel good, but you can leave them behind without the end having to be the end-all be-all. When I think of Community or 30 Rock or Parks and Rec, I don't think I could tell you the plotline in the final episode. It's not that it was good or bad, so much as these are shows that I can pick up and put down without getting lost in the larger meta story. I have a sneaking suspicion that some crime procedurals fall into this category. Shows like CSI or NCIS or some other acronym I can never remember. Besides an occasional break from the norm, if you watch CSI, you can expect there to be a murder investigation, and then some kind of resolution. It's a 42-minute story instead of a sitcom's 25 minutes, but it shares the same property of resetting at the end of each episode. Too bad I don't have the licensing rights for Asia's Heat of the Moment. Sorry, Supernatural reference. Anyways, when it comes to shows that either have a big narrative arc or rely on an episodic format, it seems to be easier to not mess up an ending if you have that episode format. This is why it's so easy to put on a sitcom or a crime drama and rewatch it over and over again without worrying about how it all concludes. A narrative show with a strong narrative ending is possible. It's just much harder to do. And it's probably easier for miniseries like Band of Brothers because they're shorter and have a driving narrative that guarantees they'll get to that planned end. Which brings us to next time on In Defense of Fandom. Does it matter why a show ended? Writers are juggling different challenges between when a show is canceled versus if they manage to go out on their own terms. How do these two reasons for ending affect a show's conclusion?
Fine. That's the way you want it? Story's over. Welcome to the end.
See you in 2 weeks. Editorial support was provided by Dr. Anna Funk. Music was composed and performed by Chris Scott. Cover art was designed by Liz Hand. In Defense of Fandom was made possible through an unhealthy obsession and your support via Ko-fi. Thanks especially to Meg B and Catalanta, who are the first supporters of this season of the pod. If you're not already supporting the show and you'd like to, you can find a link in the show notes to our Ko-fi. A one-time donation of any amount will get you access to behind-the-scenes content, including the audio of my full conversation with Richard Speight Jr., as well as Destination Toast, and some other guests you'll be hearing from across the season. Your support is deeply appreciated. And I know I promised a discussion around Band of Brothers, but I realized I didn't have very much content there. So instead, I'll leave you with this quote from Rich.
I've been on a limited series like Band of Brothers where you knew it was going to end. And so your emotional journey was different because you knew it was coming, but nonetheless impactful because it was still a bummer to have it be wrapping up. But you at least weren't blindsided. You at least were, prepared when you got hired. You knew when you'd be coming home. And so it's emotional, but it's an expected emotion.